Now think on these things from our gospel reading, Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and fatted cattle that have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners, invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets, gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. And he asked, 'How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?' And the man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'"
All right, well, I'd love to shed some light on the gospel reading today, but I'm not going to do that. I was really, you probably want to hear about the guy well, what about his wedding clothes, right? I'm not going to talk about it. Sorry. I really was, sorry about that. But I was really captured by our passage from Philippians today. It's a beautiful passage, and that's really been the theme of our service. About joy. So let me ask you this, what brings you joy? Can you think of something that brings you joy? Think about it, and I want you to, if you have a pen and paper, you can write it down. If not, just visualize it. What is it that brings you joy? It could be anything. I don't really care what it is. Whatever it is, no judgments here. Does what you wrote down or thought about, does it bring you joy all the time, or maybe joy comes a little reluctantly now and then? I teach an early spinning class at 5:15 in the morning here, and usually I get up around 4:15 in the morning to get here and to get the place open. And there are some mornings where it feels like a real chore, as you might imagine. And I'm sure that's also true for the people who show up to the class, that sometimes you just don't want to get up and do it. Not only am I getting up early, but you're not getting up to drink coffee, right? You're getting up to exercise, to put out some effort, and most of the time it's before most people get out of bed. So I start the music, I warm up, and I keep time for the class, so I always have to check my watch. I know exactly how much time I have left before I'm finished. 10 minutes go by, then 20 minutes, and I think to myself, that's a long way to go. Do I want to finish this morning? Do I want to just like get off the bike and say, sorry, here's a refund, I'm going home? But I keep going, because once you hit like the 20-minute mark, it would be more of a pain to get off the bike and go home. You're already sweaty, just finish the class, you know? But then this kind of magical thing happens at the 30-minute mark. I don't know what it is. And you can be on a treadmill too. Something about staying in place for that long where your mind just kind of switches gears and you just kind of resign yourself to what you're doing. And I know that I have 15 minutes to go in the class, and suddenly my outlook changes. I start to feel good. All of a sudden it's fun. You hear the music, things kind of set in differently, and it's fun. You know you're gonna be fine. You're gonna be better than fine. By the end of the class, I've rediscovered the joy of spinning class. How do you feel about that, Darren?
I don't know what class you're going to. I don't feel that way.
You You're a work in progress. You're a work in progress. You're a work in progress. Yeah. It takes a little while to get there, maybe. Not only did I manage to get up and manage to work out, but I managed to burn some calories. I managed to sweat. I managed to accomplish something. Even if you think finishing an exercise class is silly or whatever, still accomplishing something. And it gives me a great sense of satisfaction. By the time I'm done, I have never regretted anything I've gotten up for early in the morning, whether it's a run or a ride or any kind of a workout. There's those initial moments of hesitancy, like, do I want to do this? There's that early in the workout moment of doubt. But then joy and happiness, a sense of contentment is realized in the backstretch. So when I finish with a wow. I did that, whether it's 30 minutes or 3 hours, or yesterday I went out and ran 50K in the woods in Pennsylvania, and that took me 6 hours and 37 minutes. It's a long time to be out in the woods. But it was fun. It was a good time. It was joyful, believe it or not. Now, for many people, and you might be among them, if you think about joy, joy often comes reluctantly when it comes to the church. Some of those days, when you go to church, you get up, you get ready, and then you wonder why. You ever have one of those days? Maybe today was one of those mornings. Maybe it's a church event that you signed up for. You think, why did I sign up for that a month ago? I just don't feel like going today. Maybe you actually created an event at church. Or you've organized it, and now you have to show up. You can't even get sort of sick suddenly and then not show up. You have to go. Ever had one of those? Sometimes we show up out of a sense of duty. Sometimes we show up out of a sense of calling. Sometimes we do it because we show up, we feel like showing up to church is like taking our medicine, kind of that, but it's good for you, right? Those are all the fine reasons for doing something, fine reasons for going to church. But there's not a lot of joy to be had in those reasons, is there? When you're trying to convince yourself to do something. But even in those times that you had to convince yourself to be there, did you end up discovering joy at some point? Through worship or serving in some kind of a mission? Did you find a sense of joy, a sense of contentment, that everything in the world is right again, or at least in your world, or could possibly be right through serving? But even then, it doesn't always happen, does it? Sometimes you're in an argument with a friend at church, and it feels uncomfortable to be there. Life together in the church, it can be a grind. It can be dull at times. It can be frustrating at times. It can be angry or sad at times. And if there's no joy to be found in the midst of all that, those different things, sometimes it can be a pretty toxic environment. And that happens to a lot of people. Even people with the best of intentions find themselves slip away from the church for one reason or another. Joy is the secret ingredient to succeeding as a church together. So look for joy. I want you to think about joy in the context of our passage from Philippians. Paul wrote the letter of Philippians to people in a church that brought him a great deal of joy. But this church that brought him joy also brought him a great deal of angst. And we see at several points how Paul is concerned that his friends are fighting amongst themselves, dividing up the church. And that's what being a pastor is like, especially when you've been there for a while, or in my case, when you've come back to a congregation you grew up in. You love the people, but you also worry about them all the time because you do know them so well. In Philippi, this congregation sometimes fights over its status, sometimes over its leadership, sometimes it fights over its accomplishments. Sometimes the people fight amongst themselves over their religiosity. Over and over again, Paul reminds them that the way the world ranks itself, is not the way the church ranks itself. And we've already looked at those examples in previous weeks. But we get to this part of Paul's letter in chapter 4, and he starts out by calling out two people. Take a look at verses 1 and 2. He says, "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord." These two women, two leaders in the church, for one reason or another, are at odds with each other, and they're being at odds with each other is really threatening to divide up the church in a way that's dangerous for the health of the congregation. But it's interesting, the solution. What can be done? It's simple, says Paul in verse 3. Just maybe give them a hand. He says in verse 3, "Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, to help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life." You know, in church life, we can get into the weeds a lot, kind of because of the way institutional life is. It kind of collides with our desires and goals to be Christ followers. And some of those who are at work in the church work and work and work, and they get tired. And then they get frustrated. You know, in all churches, it's usually true that 90% of the people, or 90% of the work is done by 10% of the people. Now, it's a little different here because just about everybody takes a hand at something. But even so, generally speaking, 90% of the work is done by 10% of the people. Now, bigger congregations deal with this by hiring more staff. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? But it's not really an option for us. And it's actually not an option for most churches, is it? So when it gets to be too much, guess what happens? It gets to be too much, and we start treating our fellow workers like they're the competition instead of their being like family. Why do we do this? Why do we take it out on the people close to us? Well, because they're close to us, right? They're the only people we can find that we can vent to. And so we end up, unfortunately, taking it out on them. Sometimes all that we really need is help. When you're in the moment, though, it's hard to ask for help, isn't it? Personally speaking, you guys are so incredibly creative.
We were coached.
Oh, really?
I'll shoot you.
Oh, that makes me laugh. You guys are awesome.
Let's finish this shirt.
Oh, man. That was fun. It was just so very unexpected. You know, when you're in the moment, it's hard to ask for help. It doesn't matter who you are. Personally speaking, I'm a doer. I'm not a planner, as my leaders can tell you. I'm not an organizer, as Judy can tell you. Usually I just want to get something done. And so I'm spontaneous, and I don't plan well. And so a lot of times I just go ahead and try to make it happen. And sometimes in trying to make it happen, you have varying degrees of success or not. So look, if you see somebody who's having a terrible time in church, and it could be anybody, but especially our leaders, the best thing to do is just ask how you can be helpful. Because it's so appreciated and it's so rarely done. Usually what we say is, when we see somebody having a terrible day in the church, what do we usually do? Wow, what is his problem? What is her problem, you know? Instead of saying, hey, can I help you? It makes all the difference in the world. Because when we join with one another, the burden becomes lighter, and we rediscover the joy of our work. And we realize that we have partners in ministry, partners who want to see the church succeed. Paul says it's all about joy. If you look at verses 4 through 7, Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Do you see how that whole thing begins with a sense of joy in the Lord? As he does throughout his letter, Paul reminds us to always find our joy in the Lord. If you look at the number of times Paul mentions joy in Philippians, it's more often than he mentions division. Now, joy is a fruit of the Spirit. Joy is a product of our Christian faith. It's something that should happen naturally. So if you don't quite understand what I mean by that, think of it this way. Joy is a state of mind more than anything else. And sometimes you have to allow yourself to be joyful, because it's the antidote to whatever happens to ail us as a community. The church can be so focused on trying to do the right thing that it can often become a stuffy place. It can have an atmosphere that kills creativity and spontaneity and positivity. We don't intend for it to be that way, do we? But it just happens because we have to be intentional about finding joy in what we do. God turns our lives into an incredible venture. An ordinary day can become extraordinary when we acknowledge God's presence at work in our lives. When we do a convenience meal and it makes so many people's day, it's great. God is at work. When we go down to the community mission and we do something down there, and we give people joy who don't have much, who don't experience much joy. That's awesome. That we get to see God at work. When you pray with a friend who's going through a difficult time and you start to see things turn around in their lives, that's joy. That's God at work. When someone we know accepts Jesus as their Lord and Savior, the privilege of being a part of that is indescribable. That's joy. That's God at work. It's incredible to experience God working through us and in us. None of that, by the way, if you're thinking about in terms of mission, none of that, by the way, requires that you go around the world or go to a dangerous place. Sometimes the biggest life adventures that we can have with God are going to happen right in our own backyard, just by following Jesus. Because when you influence your neighbors and your friends in a positive way, it's a change you get to live with and experience every day. You get to see God at work day by day. As Paul says in verses 8 and 9, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. Did you catch the choir singing that a little earlier? If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. When it comes to working in the church or attending church or showing up to church events, there are a lot of things that can get you down. And you can focus on those things, and pretty soon it just kind of ruins the whole experience. But if you look for God at work in your life, and you look for God at work in the life of the church, if you learn to uncover the joy to be found here, it not only enhances your life, but it spills out into everyone and into the whole community. Joy is contagious. The kingdom of heaven is like a little yeast that works into the whole batch of it. I think somebody said that one time somewhere. Paul says, focus on the right things and you'll discover joy. If we dwell on the wrong things, don't be surprised that things don't go right. Paul's words are a reminder that when things become heated or even when they become dull, it's important to step back and realize who we are and who we belong to. And there's joy to be discovered. Discover the joy in the work of our church and in your own faith. To be united in Christ and as fellow workers for the gospel. Because if we understand that, if you understand finding joy, then you understand the message of Philippians. And more than that, you understand how to be the church in good and bad times. Because if you can make that switch in your mind and your heart, you'll find an inexpressible joy. A joy that really lasts, that endures throughout your life. So, think about what you wrote down. Again, it doesn't matter what it is. This may surprise you, but I want to encourage you to start thinking about your own faith and thinking about the church in that way. I don't want you to think about it in terms of how you think you're supposed to think about your church or your faith. I want you to think about it as in terms of something that really brings you joy, whatever that may be. Because sometimes we live lives where we have the things that really make us happy, and then we have church. And we don't always have an easy time thinking about church in the same way that we think about things that make us happy. So maybe what does church need to be? How does our church need to be different? How do you need to experience church differently if it's really going to be something that brings you joy? Maybe we just need to do things a little differently in order to make that happen. Because if we did, I think that joy that we find here would be something that would affect a lot of people and would spill over into our community. So let's think about joy this morning. What brings you joy? I hope it's part of what brings you joy. It happens here at St. James.